There is a moment each morning that almost every man ignores, a quiet window before the world begins speaking to him, before notifications appear, before demands arrive, before distractions begin pulling his attention in 100 different directions. Most people sleep through this moment without realizing what they are losing, but the men who change their lives learn to protect it. Because hidden inside that early hour is something far more valuable than extra time. It is control. Most people wake up reacting to pressure, reacting to noise, reacting to problems that already own their attention before they have even taken possession of their own thoughts. And by the time they finally begin thinking clearly, the day has already shaped their emotions, their focus, and their decisions. But there is another way to live, a way that very few people ever discover. At 5 a.m., the world becomes quiet enough for a man to finally hear himself think, and in that silence, something powerful begins to happen. The mind sharpens, ideas become clearer, direction becomes visible. Problems that felt overwhelming suddenly appear manageable. It is as though the noise of life has been temporarily removed, allowing the deeper part of the mind to speak without interruption. Most people believe success comes only from working harder, longer hours, more effort, more activity. But history repeatedly shows something different. The men who rise above the ordinary are often the men who learn to master the beginning of the day before everyone else even wakes up. They understand that success is not built only through effort. It is built through preparation, through clarity, through deliberate thought before action. Every great achievement begins first as a thought, but thoughts are fragile. They require silence to grow. And most people never give themselves enough silence to hear the ideas that could transform their future. Instead, they rush immediately into reaction. They check messages. They consume noise. They absorb the fears, opinions, and distractions of other people before establishing control over their own mind. And because of that, their direction becomes scattered before the day has even truly begun. Now imagine the opposite. Imagine waking up while the world is still quiet, before fear has fully awakened, before doubt has had a chance to interfere, before distraction begins competing for your attention. You sit alone with your thoughts, and instead of reacting to life, you begin shaping it. That is where transformation begins. There was once a man with no wealth, no influence, no connections, and no guarantee of success. Yet he possessed one thing that separated him from millions of others: a definite decision. A decision so strong that it refused to wait for perfect conditions. While others delayed, he moved. While others hesitated, he acted. While others searched for certainty, he committed himself fully to a direction long before success became visible. That man was Edwin C. Barnes. Most people remember the outcome. They remember that he eventually became the business partner of Thomas Edison. But very few understand what truly created that transformation. It was not luck. It was not privilege. It was not talent alone. It was the habit of acting before the world could convince him not to. And that is the hidden power of the 5 a.m. habit. It is not simply about waking early. It is about becoming the kind of man who decides first, the kind of man who thinks clearly before the world interferes, the kind of man who creates direction instead of drifting through reaction. Because the truth is harsh but simple. Most people do not fail because they lack intelligence or potential. They fail because they hesitate at the exact moment action is required. They wait too long. They negotiate with fear. They delay until opportunity disappears quietly without announcement. The men who rise early understand something most people never learn. Opportunity rarely arrives loudly. It appears quietly and often only to those prepared enough to recognize it. And preparation is built in silence, in discipline, in the early morning hours when no one is watching. That is why the morning matters so much. Not because of the clock itself, but because of what the hour represents. Control, clarity, intention, identity. And once a man learns to take control of his mornings, he slowly begins taking control of something much greater: his direction, his confidence, his future. I have spent many years studying the difference between men who merely wish for success and men who eventually command it, and I have discovered something surprising. The separation rarely begins in public. It does not begin when opportunity appears. It does not begin when wealth arrives. It begins in private, in silence, in the unnoticed moments before the world demands a man's attention. Most people underestimate the importance of the beginning of the day because they misunderstand how success is formed. They believe success is built only through visible effort, through motion, through activity, through long hours spent chasing results. But the truth is far deeper than that. Success begins first with mental organization, and mental organization can only occur when a man learns to separate himself from distraction long enough to think clearly. That is why the early hour carries such unusual power. At 5 a.m., the mind exists in a different condition. The noise of the world has not yet entered. Fear has not yet multiplied through conversation, comparison, or pressure. A man stands briefly alone with his own thoughts, and in that moment, he faces the most important question of all. Will I direct my life today, or will I allow circumstances to direct it for me? Most men never consciously answer that question. They drift immediately into reaction. They wake up and surrender themselves to urgency, messages, problems, demands, entertainment, noise. Their attention becomes scattered before they have established any direction of their own. And because their attention is scattered, their power becomes scattered with it. The early rising man lives differently. He understands that before he can control outcomes, he must first control thought. Before he can shape results, he must shape focus. Before he can build external success, he must establish internal order. This is where definiteness of purpose begins. I have observed that the majority of people suffer not from lack of ability, but from divided desire. They want many things, but commit fully to nothing. Their thoughts move constantly from one idea to another, one ambition to another, one distraction to another. And because their energy is divided, their progress remains weak. A definite mind becomes powerful because it concentrates force. The man who rises early gains an enormous advantage because he enters the day before confusion begins. He sits alone and asks himself questions most people avoid for an entire lifetime. What do I truly want? What am I building? What am I willing to sacrifice? What action must I take today that moves me closer to that result? These questions appear simple, yet they terrify most people because they demand clarity, and clarity removes excuses. Once a man knows exactly what he wants, he can no longer hide behind confusion. He can no longer blame circumstances for drifting. He must either act or admit that fear controls him. That is why the early hour becomes transformational. It forces honesty. Edwin C. Barnes understood this principle long before success appeared in his life. When he made the decision to become associated with Thomas Edison, he possessed no reasonable evidence that such an outcome was possible. He had no money, no influence, no guarantee, yet he held one advantage over countless others. His desire was definite. He did not say, "I hope something good happens." He did not say, "Maybe one day I'll become successful." He fixed a precise aim inside his mind. That is where power begins. A vague desire produces weak action. A definite desire organizes thought into direction, and once direction becomes fixed, the mind begins unconsciously searching for ways to move toward it. Most people never experience this because they never hold one aim long enough for it to organize their behavior. They constantly restart, constantly reconsider, constantly change direction. And because of that, they remain trapped in beginnings. The 5 a.m. habit interrupts that cycle. It creates a daily moment where a man reconnects himself to his purpose before the world has a chance to pull him away from it. This is why repetition matters so much. Many people misunderstand repetition. They believe repeating goals or reading affirmations is meaningless, but repetition is the mechanism through which the subconscious mind accepts instruction. A thought repeated consistently with emotion begins transforming identity itself. The man who rises each morning and repeats his purpose begins changing internally long before visible success appears externally. His decisions sharpen. His behavior changes. His attention becomes selective. his confidence strengthens, and eventually his entire life begins reorganizing around the direction he has chosen. This is not magic. It is mental conditioning. Most men condition themselves unconsciously through fear, distraction, and repetition of negative thought. The disciplined man chooses conscious conditioning instead. That is why mornings become sacred. The early hour is not valuable because successful people enjoy suffering or exhaustion. It is valuable because it provides uninterrupted access to thought before external influence takes control. A man who controls the first hour of his day eventually gains greater control over the direction of his life. Others begin noticing this transformation even when they cannot explain it. They see that he speaks differently, he hesitates less, he appears calmer under pressure. He no longer drifts emotionally with every circumstance. They may call it discipline, they may call it confidence. But what they are truly observing is mental organization. The scattered man reacts. The organized man decides. This difference changes everything. Most people wait until they feel motivated before acting, but motivation is unstable. It disappears quickly when conditions become uncomfortable. The man who depends upon feeling remains inconsistent because feelings change constantly. The disciplined man learns something deeper. Action must be based on decision, not emotion. This is one of the greatest psychological shifts a person can ever make. The average man asks himself each morning, "How do I feel?" The exceptional man asks, "What must be done?" That distinction separates dreamers from builders. And this is exactly why the early morning habit transforms identity over time. Each morning becomes proof that you can command yourself, proof that you can act despite resistance, proof that your purpose matters more than temporary comfort. Every time a man rises early to think clearly, define his aim, and move deliberately toward it, he strengthens self-trust. And self-trust is one of the most valuable forms of power a human being can possess. Because once a man truly trusts himself, hesitation weakens, fear loses authority. Excuses stop controlling behavior. He no longer needs constant external motivation because he has built internal command. This is also why so many people avoid silence. Silence exposes uncertainty. It reveals distraction. It forces confrontation with the truth of how undirected most lives actually are. Noise becomes an escape. Distraction becomes anesthesia. Busyness becomes a substitute for purpose. But at 5 a.m., there is nowhere left to hide. The man must face himself honestly, and if he continues doing this long enough, something remarkable begins happening. He no longer drifts through life emotionally reacting to everything around him. He starts becoming intentional with his attention, intentional with his time, intentional with his associations, intentional with his future. This change appears small in the beginning, but over years it becomes enormous, because every great life is built through repeated direction, not occasional inspiration. The majority of people never establish this direction. They live in cycles of reaction, one day motivated, the next day distracted, one week ambitious, the next week uncertain. They rely on emotional momentum instead of disciplined structure. But the early morning habit slowly removes dependence on emotion. The man rises whether he feels inspired or not. He thinks clearly whether circumstances feel favorable or not. He acts before comfort has a chance to negotiate with him. And through this repetition, he develops something rare: consistency. Consistency creates momentum. Momentum creates confidence. Confidence creates courage. And courage creates opportunity. This is why small morning actions become life-changing over time. The world sees sudden success, but success is almost never sudden. It is accumulated silently through repeated invisible decisions. The decision to wake up early, the decision to think deliberately, the decision to define purpose clearly, the decision to act before fear gains strength. These decisions appear insignificant individually, but repeated daily, they alter the entire direction of a man's life. There is another principle hidden inside the 5 a.m. habit that most people never notice. The early hour protects imagination. Imagination is one of the greatest forces of achievement. Yet modern life destroys it constantly through overstimulation. Most people consume endlessly but create very little. Their minds become filled with noise before original thought ever has a chance to emerge. But silence restores imagination. In quietness, ideas connect differently. Solutions appear unexpectedly. Possibilities become visible. A man begins seeing patterns and opportunities invisible to distracted minds. This is precisely why many great thinkers throughout history guarded periods of solitude so carefully. They understood that creativity requires uninterrupted attention. Thomas Edison often worked during hours when others rested because he recognized the unusual power of concentrated thought without interruption. Great achievement rarely emerges from scattered attention. It emerges from focused mental energy sustained long enough to produce insight. The modern world fights aggressively against this kind of concentration. Everything competes for attention. Everything encourages reaction instead of reflection. That is why rising early becomes almost rebellious in a distracted culture. It is a declaration that your mind belongs to you before it belongs to the world. And this psychological ownership changes identity deeply. A man who controls his mornings begins feeling different internally. He senses that he is no longer merely surviving circumstances. He is directing them. This sense of direction becomes addictive in the best possible way, because human beings are not designed merely to react endlessly. They are designed to create, build, move, pursue, and shape. Without purpose, energy collapses inward and becomes anxiety. With purpose, energy becomes disciplined movement. The early morning habit channels energy toward purpose before fear and distraction scatter it, and eventually, this creates separation. The disciplined man begins moving differently from the average man. He notices opportunities earlier. He acts faster. He thinks more clearly. He tolerates discomfort better. He trusts his decisions more deeply, not because he was born different, but because he repeatedly trained himself to think before reacting. That is what most people misunderstand about self-mastery. It is not built through dramatic moments. It is built through repeated private victories no one else sees. Waking up when comfort says stay asleep. Thinking clearly when distraction demands attention. Acting deliberately before hesitation gains strength. These are the invisible victories that eventually create visible success. And once a man experiences this transformation internally, he can no longer return comfortably to drifting, because he has seen what clarity feels like. He has experienced what intentional living feels like. He realizes that most people are not lacking opportunity. They are lacking direction, and direction is established first in silence. There comes a point in every man's life when he must decide whether he will continue living reactively or begin living deliberately. Most never recognize this moment clearly because it does not arrive dramatically. It arrives quietly, hidden inside ordinary mornings, repeated choices, and unnoticed habits. One man continues sleeping through his potential, while another rises before dawn and slowly changes the entire direction of his future. That is the true difference. Not intelligence, not luck, not even opportunity at first, but disciplined direction sustained long enough to reshape identity. Most people underestimate how deeply habits influence destiny because habits appear small while they are being formed. Waking up early seems insignificant for one day. Reading for 1 hour appears minor. Thinking deliberately each morning feels unremarkable. But repeated consistently over years, these behaviors begin separating one life from another with astonishing force. This is exactly what happened with Edwin C. Barnes. People often study successful men by examining the visible outcome while ignoring the invisible preparation that created it. They look at partnership, wealth, influence, and recognition while overlooking the mental conditioning that allowed those things to emerge. But the real transformation always begins internally, long before circumstances visibly change. Barnes did not become successful merely because he met Thomas Edison. Thousands of men met powerful people throughout history and remained ordinary. The difference was not proximity alone. The difference was preparedness. Preparedness is psychological before it becomes external. Most people are not prepared for opportunity when it arrives because they spend years training themselves into distraction, inconsistency, hesitation, and emotional dependence. Then, when opportunity finally appears, they lack the internal discipline required to recognize it or sustain it. The disciplined morning habit reverses this process. It trains attention. It strengthens decision making. It develops emotional control. It teaches a man to move before comfort gives permission. And over time, this changes the way he responds to life itself. The average man waits to feel confident before acting. The disciplined man acts repeatedly until confidence is produced through experience. That distinction changes everything. Confidence is not created through wishing, positive thinking alone, or temporary motivation. Real confidence emerges from evidence. From repeatedly proving to yourself that you can follow through despite resistance. Every morning a man rises early and honors his purpose before distraction enters the day. He creates evidence. Evidence that he can control himself. Evidence that he can direct his attention intentionally. Evidence that he can act according to decision rather than emotion. This evidence slowly rewrites identity. And identity controls behavior more deeply than motivation ever will. Most people try changing their lives without changing identity. They attempt temporary action while maintaining the same self-image internally. And because identity remains unchanged, old patterns eventually reclaim control. The man still sees himself as inconsistent, still sees himself as undisciplined, still sees himself as someone who starts but rarely finishes. So eventually, his actions return to match that identity. But the repeated early morning discipline begins altering self-perception itself. The man no longer says, "I'm trying to become disciplined." He begins realizing, "I am disciplined." That change is enormous psychologically, because once identity shifts, behavior becomes easier to maintain. The man no longer forces himself constantly. He acts according to who he believes himself to be. This is why so many successful people protect routines obsessively. They understand that routines are not merely organizational tools. They are identity reinforcement systems. The 5 a.m. habit repeatedly tells the subconscious mind, "I am someone who acts intentionally. I am someone who controls himself. I am someone who moves before excuses appear." And over time, the subconscious begins accepting these statements as truth because behavior repeatedly confirms them. Most people unknowingly do the opposite. They repeatedly reinforce weakness through behavior. They delay important action. They break promises to themselves. They surrender quickly to distraction. And every repeated act of inconsistency becomes evidence supporting a weaker identity. Then they wonder why confidence disappears. Confidence disappears when a man stops trusting himself, and a man stops trusting himself when his actions repeatedly contradict his intentions. This is why the early morning habit becomes so powerful. It rebuilds self-respect quietly. A man who consistently rises early to pursue his purpose begins carrying himself differently. He thinks differently, speaks differently, moves differently, not because success has fully arrived yet, but because he knows internally that he is no longer drifting. That certainty creates calmness. Most people live in psychological conflict because they know they are neglecting their own potential. They distract themselves from this awareness through entertainment, busyness, endless stimulation, and temporary pleasure. But underneath the distraction remains an uncomfortable truth. They are capable of more than they are currently demanding from themselves. That hidden awareness creates anxiety because deep down, every human being wants alignment between potential and action. The disciplined man begins restoring that alignment gradually. Each early morning becomes proof that he is no longer abandoning himself internally, and this produces energy. Real energy does not come merely from rest. It comes from meaningful direction. A man moving toward a purpose feels different psychologically than a man drifting without one. His mind becomes sharper because energy now has somewhere to go. Without direction, energy becomes restlessness. With direction, energy becomes momentum. This is why ambitious men often feel most alive during periods of disciplined pursuit rather than comfort. Human beings are designed for movement toward meaningful goals. Without challenge, the mind weakens. Without purpose, attention collapses inward into fear, insecurity, and distraction. The early hour interrupts this collapse. It reminds a man daily that his future is still being shaped by his current decisions. That realization is powerful because most people unconsciously surrender to fatalism over time. They begin believing life simply happens to them. They stop seeing themselves as creators and start seeing themselves merely as reactors. But the disciplined morning habit restores authorship psychologically. The man begins understanding something critical. Circumstances influence life, but repeated decisions shape identity. And identity eventually shapes outcomes. This is why small habits become dangerous in both positive and negative directions. Small acts repeated consistently create entire futures. A distracted morning repeated for years creates one kind of life. An intentional morning repeated for years creates another entirely. The difference may appear invisible at first, but over time it becomes massive. Most people never stay consistent long enough to experience compounding transformation. They constantly restart, 1 week disciplined, the next week distracted, 1 month ambitious, the next month emotionally exhausted. They rely too heavily on temporary emotional states instead of stable systems. But systems create freedom. The early morning routine becomes a system that protects the mind from chaos before chaos has a chance to enter. That protection matters more than most people realize. Modern life constantly fragments attention. Notifications, media, comparison, urgency, entertainment, and endless stimulation slowly destroy depth of thought. And without depth of thought, meaningful achievement becomes extremely difficult because achievement requires sustained concentration. Most men cannot concentrate deeply anymore because their minds have been trained into constant interruption. They consume endlessly but rarely reflect deeply, and reflection is where transformation begins. The early hour restores depth. It allows a man to think beyond immediate survival, beyond emotional reaction, beyond temporary stimulation. This is where vision becomes possible, and vision changes behavior dramatically. A man with a clear vision tolerates discomfort differently than a man without one. Sacrifice feels meaningful instead of oppressive. Delayed gratification becomes easier. Temporary difficulty no longer appears pointless because it is connected to a larger direction. This was one of the greatest strengths possessed by Edwin C. Barnes. He saw himself differently before the world did. Long before external evidence confirmed his ambition, he held the image internally. Most people wait for circumstances to give them permission to believe in themselves. Successful men often reverse the process. They believe first. Then they organize action around that belief consistently until reality eventually aligns with it. This is why imagination matters so much. Every major achievement exists internally before it appears externally. The mind creates images first, then disciplined action gradually gives those images physical form. But imagination without discipline produces fantasy. Discipline without imagination produces exhaustion. The combination of both creates transformation. The early morning hour becomes the meeting place for these forces. A man imagines clearly. Then he organizes disciplined action around the vision before distraction interrupts his focus. This repeated process slowly restructures his entire life. And something fascinating begins happening psychologically during this transformation. The man stops admiring disciplined people from a distance and starts becoming one himself. That shift changes relationships too. He becomes more selective with time, more selective with attention, more selective with conversation, because purpose clarifies value. Most people waste enormous amounts of energy simply because they never define clearly what matters most. And without clarity, everything competes equally for attention. The disciplined man gradually removes this confusion. He understands that attention is life itself. Whatever repeatedly receives attention eventually shapes identity. That is why mornings matter so deeply. The first hour often determines the psychological direction of the entire day. A distracted beginning usually produces scattered thinking afterward. An intentional beginning produces greater control. This is also why so many people fear solitude without realizing it. Solitude removes distraction and exposes thought directly. It forces a man to confront who he is becoming through his current habits. Many avoid this confrontation entirely, but the man who rises early willingly enters it every morning, and because of that, he develops unusual self-awareness. Self-awareness creates power because it reveals patterns before they fully control behavior. The man notices distraction earlier, notices weakness earlier, notices emotional drift earlier, and because he notices it sooner, he can correct it faster. Most people never correct patterns because they never observe them honestly long enough. The disciplined morning habit creates observation. Observation creates adjustment. Adjustment creates progress. Progress creates belief. And belief sustained through action eventually becomes destiny. That is why the 5 a.m. habit is never truly about the hour itself. The clock is symbolic. What matters is the decision behind it. The decision to lead yourself before life leads you. The decision to think before reacting. The decision to pursue purpose before comfort. The decision to build identity intentionally instead of unconsciously drifting into mediocrity. And over time, these repeated decisions produce a man who no longer waits passively for opportunity. He becomes prepared enough to recognize it, disciplined enough to pursue it, and mentally strong enough to sustain it once it arrives. That is the deeper lesson hidden inside the story of Barnes and Edison. An ordinary man transformed his future not through luck, but through disciplined alignment between purpose, thought, and action repeated consistently over time. And that same possibility still exists for any man willing to master himself before attempting to master the world. Most people spend their lives searching for dramatic breakthroughs while ignoring the quiet habits that actually shape destiny. They wait for motivation, opportunity, confidence, or perfect conditions to suddenly transform their future. But transformation rarely arrives that way. It is usually built slowly, privately, and repeatedly through decisions so small that most people underestimate them completely. That is why the 5 a.m. habit matters so deeply. Not because waking early automatically guarantees success, not because successful men enjoy exhaustion or suffering, but because the habit represents something far more important than time itself. It represents self-command. It is the decision to direct your mind before the world directs it for you. It is the refusal to begin each day reactively. It is the discipline of creating clarity before distraction enters. And over time, this changes everything. The average person wakes up already mentally scattered. Before their own goals have fully entered consciousness, other people's demands already control their attention. Messages, pressure, urgency, comparison, entertainment, and endless stimulation immediately begin shaping thought. And because attention becomes fragmented, energy becomes fragmented too. But the disciplined man creates separation before chaos arrives. He protects silence. He protects thought. He protects purpose. And through this repeated protection, he slowly develops an internal stability most people never experience. That stability becomes power. Because a man who can control his attention can eventually control his direction. And a man who controls his direction gains an enormous advantage over those constantly reacting emotionally to circumstances. This was one of the hidden strengths behind Edwin C. Barnes. Before the world recognized him, he had already recognized himself internally. Before success appeared externally, he had already committed himself mentally to a definite purpose. That commitment organized his behavior long before results became visible. Most people reverse this process. They wait for external proof before believing fully in themselves. They wait for evidence before commitment. They wait for certainty before movement. And because of that, they remain trapped in hesitation for years. But the disciplined man understands something different. Identity must often be built internally before circumstances reflect it externally. This is why repeated habits become so powerful psychologically. Every morning a man rises intentionally. He strengthens the belief that he is capable of directing his own life. Every morning he honors purpose before comfort. He reinforces self-respect. Every morning he acts deliberately, despite resistance. He weakens the authority of distraction, laziness, and fear. And eventually, these invisible victories accumulate. The world may not notice immediately, but the man notices. He begins thinking differently, acting differently, expecting more from himself. He no longer sees discipline as punishment. He begins understanding it as freedom. Freedom from chaos, freedom from inconsistency, freedom from emotional dependence, freedom from drifting endlessly through years without direction. That is the deeper transformation most people never fully understand. The goal is not simply waking up early. The goal is becoming the kind of man who can command himself consistently. Because once a man develops that ability, every part of life begins changing alongside it. His focus improves, his confidence deepens, his decisions sharpen, his standards rise. He tolerates discomfort more effectively because he no longer expects growth to feel easy. And slowly, opportunity begins responding differently to him. Not because the world suddenly became fairer, but because he became more prepared, more disciplined, more aware, more capable of recognizing and sustaining opportunity when it appears. Most people never reach this stage because they constantly restart. They rely on temporary inspiration instead of repeated structure. They wait for emotion instead of building systems. And because of that, their progress never compounds long enough to produce major transformation. But the disciplined morning habit creates continuity, and continuity creates momentum. Momentum creates identity. Identity creates destiny. This is why seemingly small habits can separate one life from another so dramatically over time. A distracted morning repeated for 10 years creates one outcome. An intentional morning repeated for 10 years creates another entirely different future. At first, the difference appears invisible, but eventually it becomes impossible to ignore. The disciplined man develops clarity while others remain confused. He develops self-trust while others remain uncertain. He develops momentum while others remain trapped in cycles of hesitation. And perhaps most importantly, he develops belief in his own ability to shape life intentionally instead of merely reacting to it passively. That belief changes how a man walks through the world. He no longer waits constantly for permission. He no longer negotiates endlessly with fear. He no longer depends entirely on emotional motivation. He acts because action has become part of his identity. And once action becomes identity, progress accelerates naturally. This is the true lesson hidden beneath the story of Edwin C. Barnes and Thomas Edison. An ordinary man changed his future because he learned to organize his thoughts, direct his energy, and align his habits with a definite purpose long before success became visible. That transformation did not happen overnight. It happened quietly, in repeated mornings, in disciplined decisions, in moments where purpose became stronger than comfort. And the same principle still applies today. Every morning offers a man two choices: drift unconsciously into distraction, or deliberately shape the direction of his own mind before the world attempts to shape it for him. Most people never realize how much their future is hidden inside that choice. But the few who understand it begin living differently. They stop treating mornings casually. They stop surrendering attention carelessly. They stop wasting the clearest hours of the day reacting emotionally to everything around them. Instead, they think, plan, reflect, focus, move deliberately. And through that repeated discipline, they slowly become different people entirely. That is the real power of the 5 a.m. habit. Not simply productivity, not merely waking early, but the gradual construction of a stronger mind, a clearer purpose, and a more disciplined identity capable of creating a completely different future. Because in the end, success rarely belongs to the man who waits. It belongs to the man who prepares himself before opportunity arrives. And preparation begins long before sunrise.